So for me, it's important to start by defining the design direction I want to go in. This can be loose or focused depending on what I'm going for, but I find it's always good to have in mind the style of the kitbash I want to create. I do this by approaching the project like I would a normal design, by writing a short brief and gathering some references to work from. In this chapter, I'm going to outline some questions you can ask yourself in order to define your design direction. The first thing to do is to come up with an idea to drive the process. Maybe there's a particular photo reference that sparks something interesting, or a piece of artwork you find inspirational. I was searching for a spark of inspiration whilst researching for this project, and I found this military scout vehicle that I thought had some really cool shapes. It's nice and lightweight and has lots of negative space. That, coupled with this scout mech I painted a while back, I decided I wanted to base my kitbash set around this military scout mech idea. I also find it useful to write some keywords so I have a starting point and an overall vision for when I'm writing the brief and collecting the ref. You can also get ideas from your real-world interests. For example, if you're into Formula One racing, maybe you'd head in that direction, kind of a Formula One racing mech. So here's some useful questions that I ask myself in order to write a brief. You can answer all or some of them, or none at all. For me, I like to be a bit more rigid with what I'm designing so I don't get lost. So I've answered all of the questions. What will it do? As already discussed, it's going to be a military-style scout mech. By answering this question, I now have a problem that I need to solve with my design, and a rough image in my head of the kind of place I want to end up. The project might not necessarily go in the direction that I'm envisioning, but I like to have that constraint in place so I don't end up spending too much time modelling too much stuff. Who is it for? I'm thinking the pilot of this thing will be a kind of risk-taking maverick type of character. This question isn't very important at this stage, but later on I can add some character and storytelling into my final design if I'm thinking about who it's for. Where is it from? Sometimes it can be useful to consider geographical location. I'm going for a Western military style, probably American, which is fairly standard, but you could similarly have something like the Moon or Great Barrier Reef, which would further drive the look and feel of the design. When is it from? I'm going for a near future setting for this design, and my ref gathering will reflect that, but it could be in the past or in the far future, for example. This question, along with the previous question, drastically changes the types of references you'll be gathering in the next stage. For example, if you were looking at England in the 1800s, you'd be seeking out Victorian references, which would be a lot different from, say, Japan in 2050. How big? I like to keep scale in mind when I'm designing. This will dictate the types of parts I'm creating too. Larger objects can have more large areas of little or no detail, for example, whereas smaller scale objects might have a more concentrated detail breakup. I'm probably going for a mech that's about 8 meters tall. What is it made from? This is also useful to keep in mind when gathering refs. The answer is quite standard for this brief though, cast and machine metal, possibly some plastics and rubbers. I've also come up with a secondary brief as a backup, but I've made it totally different from the first, a lightweight 3D printed racing mech. I won't be building separate parts for this brief, but we'll see if there's something we can do with this later on. The next thing to do is to build a ref board and start identifying interesting parts that you're going to model. I'm now going to go through how I use Pinterest to create my ref board. So the great thing about Pinterest is that you can often find these threads of references that lead you in really cool directions that you wouldn't have necessarily gone down had you just been typing search terms into Google. This is the front page of my Pinterest, and because of my activity on the website is already filled up with some pretty cool stuff. I'm just going to have a look through this first and open up anything I see onto a new tab. As you can see on the left there, I've got a few tabs open that I found previously and didn't want to lose. You can also type search terms, and it's good to play around with these to try and find that first hook of the thread so you can start building the board. All I've typed in here is simply military vehicle. It's a bit broad and I'm not getting the kinds of results I want initially, but as I'm scrolling through, assessing if any of the refs are what I have in my mind for the project, I spot the exact type of vehicle I'm looking for. This then leads on to similar looking vehicles, and now I have access to tons of reference for the type of mech I have in my head. This is why I love Pinterest. All it takes is one good image and it opens up a rabbit hole into some really decent reference material. If anything, you need to be careful not to get stuck just looking at reference and not produce any actual work. When I find something interesting, I'll open it in a new tab and keep going down until I'm sure I don't need anything else on that page anymore, and I'll move on to the next tab. There's so much cool stuff on Pinterest, but a lot of the images are quite low res, so a lot of the time they're only good for references and not texturing, which we'll cover later. As you can see here, I'm just going through the process, picking out interesting things that I think will fit the design language I have in my head, and also finding things that I hadn't necessarily considered. I'm also always looking for parts that I think would be interesting to model up for the kitbash set. I think these bike refs are kind of cool. They may be straying too far from the brief, but looking at them, I'm thinking stuff like, what if the mech had wheels on its feet like roller skates? Reference will spark these kinds of ideas as you go through. I'm also just copying them straight into my PureRef board rather than saving, just to save a bit of time and to cut out a step. I usually just keep all my references on a PureRef board and wouldn't really look at them individually, so I don't mind not actually having them saved onto my machine. So having found some pretty decent refs for the lightweight framed vehicle, I think it's time to start having a look at some vehicles that have a bit more bulk to them. A kitbash library made of entirely frame-like objects won't produce very cohesive mech designs. There'll be too much negative space and it'll be really difficult to get a strong silhouette read. When I'm thinking about the kitbash library and any designs I want to make from it, I'm typically going to refer back to the 70-30 rule. I'm going to want 70% areas of rest and 30% areas of detail. It's just a rule of thumb, and I'll go into it a bit more later, but it's a good thing to keep in mind. And as before, anything I find that I think would lead to more images, I'm opening up in a new tab on the left there. Yes, I use Microsoft Edge because Bing is a better search engine and I cannot live without vertical tabs. Note that I'm only going for photo references from the real world here. You don't really want to be gathering other people's artwork at this stage, because you want the kitbash parts to be of your own creation rather than modelling from somebody else's artwork. It's up to you how many refs you get. It depends on how many parts you want for your kitbash library. I'm now getting a bit carried away with the reference gathering. It's not too much of an issue because I have a time constraint with this project, so I know when to move on to the next stage. But as mentioned before, it can be easy to fall into the trap of just having loads of reference and not doing any actual work. You can also run into the problem of having too much reference, which can dilute the idea generation and make your design process unfocused. I also had a look at some references for the alternative brief just in case. There are some really cool shapes here, just by looking at a different subject matter. Even if I don't use these for the alternative brief, they could provide a really interesting angle for the military kitbash parts. It can be really useful looking at a subject matter outside of your initial brief as a kind of wild card to mix things up. Also, a lot of these refs are quite similar on the surface, so I don't want to spend too much time rooting through all the different kinds of bike frames, as that's not going to be super useful for the designs I want to make. So this is my PureRef board for the project. As you can see at the top, I've got my notes from the brief so I can refer back to it as I go. My boards are always a bit of a mess on the surface, but there is a kind of method to the madness. I typically group things loosely in categories, and if there's anything that falls into two categories, I'll place it in between the two groups it most belongs to. It's very visual and not very organised, but I'll know my way around them, and they tend to work well for my creative process. I don't want to spend ages organising images when I could be designing. So I'm taking a look at the actual refs. I'm already seeing some really cool parts here that I can isolate and model up. What I'm looking for are different types of shapes. Larger shapes for the overall construction, medium shapes to break up the larger shapes, and detail shapes that can be used to finish off the design and add areas of noise in the design. There's also some refs I gathered earlier as well, and the initial reference that sparked the idea off. These helicopter refs are really cool, and they'll be useful because they're still military, but they're more curved, so we'll add some variety of shapes to the library. I've also got some other general construction references, as that will be useful for joints and generic mechanical parts. The board has some utility vehicle references from when I wasn't sure what the project was going to be, but I've left them on there in case there's anything interesting that I can use later on. I've also gathered a few references from the other brief as well, in case I want to tackle that at some point. The PureRef is really just a big in progress for the whole project that I'll add to as I go. I found this image of Japanese samurai armor, again before I had decided on my direction. I've kept it because I thought it was interesting and I might build on it later on, but I'll just leave it on the board for now to remind me. So with all that preparation work done, we're ready to actually start modelling some parts. In this chapter, I'm going to show you how I identified interesting parts from my reference board and then modelled them up using some really basic modelling techniques. So, jumping right in. I'm not the best modeller, so I only use a few basic techniques to get the shapes that I want. I use an add-on called QBlocker to make primitive shapes. I like it more than Blender's shape creation because it allows you to drag out shapes onto other shapes and it just feels more intuitive than having to move the 3D cursor around all the time. Once I've dragged out my basic primitive, I can then add loops to create the rough shape I need, pushing and pulling verts until I've got a good base to work from. I can then use bevels to crudely smooth out corners if necessary. For this course, there's an assumed level of Blender ability, so I'm not going to go into too much detail with all of the tools in Blender, but if there's something significant to the process, then I'll point that out when we come to it. Here, I'm removing the sides of this shape in order to simplify the geometry. I fill the open faces back in by selecting the edges and pressing F. I added a bit of detail to these sides by insetting with I and extruding along normal, which you can access by pressing Alt-E. I can then use QBlocker to create a new shape for the Boolean operation. I use this to get more complexity and to add details quickly. Just to note, I'm pressing Ctrl-A to get to the QBlocker menu. The tool I'm using to do this is HardOps. Blender standard Booleans are fine, but I find HardOps to be more intuitive and quicker to access. I select the cutting object and then the object I want to be cut, then press Q and select Difference. I can then move the shape around to get the effect I want. The thing I love about Blender Booleans is you can edit them in real time after the operation. This is great for experimentation and getting the shape that you want. All I'm doing here is editing the cutting object in edit mode like I would a normal poly object. To add edge loops here, I'm pressing Ctrl R and using the mouse wheel to select how many edges I want. You'll also notice that my objects are ghosted so I can see through them. You can enter and exit this mode by pressing Alt-Z. I like to bevel my edges so the light catches them properly in renders. I've selected the loops by pressing Shift, Alt, left mouse button. I can then bevel them as normal using Ctrl-B. Here, I'm trying to select the edges of a Boolean intersection, which doesn't usually work because of the lack of consistent edge loops, until I realise I can go to the Select menu and press Select Sharp Edges, which does the trick. Sometimes when you bevel these janky edges, you can get some overlapping and bad geometry. You can go in and fix it if it's a quick fix, but you can also fix it in Photoshop in the paint over stage. This was an easy fix, I just moved a couple of edges. My object is looking a bit faceted, so I right click and press Shade Smooth, and make sure to turn on Auto Smooth in the Object Data Properties tab to the right, which is the green triangle icon. When the overall shape is done, I'll then use the same process to add details here and there based on the photo reference. Same as before, creating a primitive with QBlocker and using HardOps to Boolean the shapes together. Here, I'm using Shift-D in edit mode to copy the shapes across inside of the object. I'm pressing H here to hide the cutter object so I can see the result more clearly. When I'm modelling, I also like to turn on cavity in the viewport shading options so I can see my shapes a bit better. I'll now show the modelling process sped up, but for the most part, I'll only be using these basic techniques. The only other important technique I use is to create tube and frame shapes, but I'll point that out when we get to it. I'm a bit stiff at the beginning of the modelling phase, so I decided to start off with the generic construction shapes for my ref board. This is because they were quite simple and I could identify the shapes easily, and I knew I'd need at least some of them when creating my mech, so I used them as a bit of a warm-up exercise. Just to note, the whole modelling process was a fair few hours, and even sped up 5 times the video would be way too long. So I've highlighted key areas, but I'm not showing the modelling of every piece in the library, but I will show the whole kitbash library at the end. It looks like I'm going into an unnecessary amount of detail here, but I can probably use these details on other parts to tie them together. This is the mindset I'm in throughout the whole process. I've added a bit of depth to that flat geometry using the Solidify modifier, which is a modifier I'll be using a lot in this chapter. Sometimes it can be useful to create shapes by extruding edges. I start with a single face and then select an edge and use the E key to extrude edges out in side view. I can then close the shape by selecting the 2 edges I want to close and pressing Ctrl E and selecting Bridge Edge Loops. When I've created the closed shape, I can move the verts around a bit, pushing and pulling to get the rough shape that I need. I then fill the empty faces by selecting the open face and pressing F. I'm just adding some extra little details here to sell the construction. I do a bit of a Boolean here to cut a geometric curve into the details, though I could have probably done it just by editing the original object, but my brain always goes to Booleans, so that might happen a few times throughout this process. Here, I'm using the proportional editing button, which is the circular icon in the middle of the top bar, to soft select parts of my model and tweak them into shape. It's a really nice way to go in and roughly tweak the proportions of things, and it can even work on hard surface objects if you're careful with it. It's a really powerful tool and you'll see me using a lot throughout this whole process. I'm going to let the rest of this part play, and next I'll be moving on to some more complicated shapes that are a bit more relevant to the brief. Having made a good start on some construction machinery shapes, I feel confident enough to start picking out shapes for my military vehicle references. I'm going to start with some simple blocky shapes, then progress to more complicated shapes later on. I'm not really sure what this object was, but I thought it was really unique and I could already see some uses for it when thinking about the kinds of mechs that I want to start building. These are the kinds of things you want to be thinking about when identifying parts you want to model for the kitbash library. Here you can see I'm using the same process of creating boolean shapes and then cutting out of the original shape. The objects might seem a bit random at the moment, but I'm just focusing on picking out things I like and things that I think would be useful in construction later on. Again, I'm going to let this part play so you can see me modelling up different parts, and next I'm going to be creating some tubular type shapes to balance out all of these blocky shapes I'm creating. Now I have some blocky shapes, I want to start creating some frame-like shapes based on that original reference I found. These should make the foundation of the mechs that I start designing later on. I start with an edge from a basic box primitive and drag out the vertices using the E key for extrude. I can then tweak the points and get the rough shape that I want based on the reference. I then grab the vertices and press Shift-Control-B to bevel the vertices to get a nice smooth curve on the points. I then convert to curve and add depth in the geometry drop-down. I find this a lot easier than starting off with a Bezier curve and trying to get the smooth corners with points and anchors. There may be a better way of doing this, but this is just the way I've gotten used to and it works fine. The rest of this chapter will be a time-lapse of the rest of the modelling process, except at the end where I'll talk a bit about modifying the parts to get some easy variety out of the parts you've created. I think there's a solid amount of shapes to start with here. I may need to add to the parts if some key shape is missing when I start designing my mechs later on, but that's part of the process. The library will grow and develop as you use it. For now, I think this is a good starting point. The next thing I can do is start to modify and combine these shapes to see if there's any new and interesting shapes I can produce from these base objects. I use the mirror modifier and move the point of origin around, experimenting to try and find different and interesting shapes. I will also do this when I'm designing the mech at the building stage, but it's a fun experimental process, so I like to bulk out the library at this point just for fun. I'm also combining the objects into bigger assemblies just to add some complexity to the library. So now that I have my base library of interesting mechanical shapes, I'll see you in the next chapter where we'll texture them up ready for construction. So, texturing. I'm going for a 2K texture atlas here as it will keep things running nice and smoothly in Blender. You can go for 4K, but for my purposes it's not necessary, as I like to do a lot of paint over in the Photoshop stage. I found some references that had some interesting shapes and details. It's useful for the images to be shot side on to make them easier to use for texturing. I'm starting off with the side view of the Hummer. I cut out the vehicle from the background using Select Subject, which is a bit rough but it does the job. I then cut the parts out I don't need. Note that I'm also changing the background colour to roughly the colour of the image I'm working on. I want to make all of this as seamless as possible to increase usability in Blender. So what I'm aiming for are large flat planes. So things like the wheels and the windows that are really dark, they're not going to be that useful for the texture. So I'm going to remove them. And the way that I do that here is by stretching the texture out by using the smudge tool set to 100% opacity. Sometimes this works well and sometimes it doesn't, but I like doing it because it keeps a nice bit of colour variation and texture when I'm painting over things to blend them in. And when I'm painting, I colour sample a lot as well, just to make sure the colours tie in together. Here I'm using the dodge tool to brighten up the front a bit. It's not always necessary, but I want this texture to be consistent tone-wise. And now that the texture's changed colour slightly, the background needs to be darkened as well. Onto the other Hummer now. Same process as before, cutting out bits I don't want and filling in the gaps to create large panels. Also, something else I like to do is use the smudge tool to create panel lines using the colours that are already there on the photo texture. This way you get little highlights and things like that and you don't have to paint those in manually. Just like the first image, I want to fill these holes where the wheels were, but I really like this folded metal detail here that's bolted onto the arch, so I copy it over to be used later. Just like the modelling process in the last chapter, the texture creation is all about being able to identify cool shapes and textures that you think will be useful in the next stage. I may be going into a little bit too much detail here, but I do really enjoy painting things over and getting them to tie together. When I start repeating these panels to create patterns and shapes, I'm going to be doing a lot of painting over just to make sure everything's seamless because it'll look better on the models. Just to finish off, this one isn't quite the right colour, so I use some hue saturation and some colour balance to get it to match the background. Now I've got two pretty decent bases for the panel details I want. I go back to my reference photos of the trucks and cut out all the interesting shapes and textures that I think could be useful. Some of them might not get used, but I won't know until I start fitting everything together. Right now, I'm just focusing on what looks cool and what I think I might be able to find use for. I'm making an effort here to straighten them all up using Photoshop guides so that I can map them onto my objects nicely. You want all of the square and rectangle shapes at 90-degree angles so that when you're mapping the UVs onto the texture, everything will appear correctly on the model and not at weird angles. Sometimes that could look cool, but it's not what I'm aiming for this build. Some of the parts are a bit tricky as they weren't photographed exactly side on, but when I get to the painting stage I can paint a lot of this out and ultimately it won't be that visible on the model. And even if it is, we can get rid of anything like that in the final paint over stage in Photoshop. Now I want to go back and start making some interesting panel shapes with the textures I cut out earlier. I cut, copy and mirror elements until I've got something that looks like it could work, then paint over to blend it all together. The same process with the other section as well. I like this process because you can get some interesting shapes and panel line separations that you might not get if you just mapped photos onto the shapes. This is all experimental at the moment, but it should give me enough to work with in Blender. I also use the smudge tool quite a lot throughout the whole texture painting process. Again, it's not totally necessary, you can just paint the colours in, but I like the way the smudge tool gives you some unusual colour variations, kind of like a colour ground in traditional painting. It just gives the textures a bit more of a tooth to them. This is quite a methodical process and it does take a bit of time depending on how careful you want to be with it, but it's really worth doing. As you'll see in the next stages of the process, having properly textured parts really brings the designs to life and adds that extra sense of scale with all of these small details and panel lines we're creating now. So, moving on around the page, I'm just fitting the odd shapes at the bottom and blending them together in their own group based on colour. As I'm going round and painting over things, I notice that these highlights from the photo are a little bit too strong and might cause some weird effects when mapping the texture onto the parts. Some colour variation is good, but this might just look like a weird highlight in the wrong place on the geometry, so I darken it down. Again, I'm probably going into a little too much detail here with the paint over, but I get carried away with this sort of stuff sometimes. Especially when you're in the zone, it can be easy to lose track of the end goal. A lot of these little painted details probably won't even be noticeable. I know I modelled some wheels, and in the next chapter I'll show you some 3D scan wheels, but I'm isolating these hubs because they can sometimes be really useful to just slap on a basic wheel model to give it some colour and some detail super quickly. I'm not sure if I'll use this part of the atlas, but it's there anyway just in case. I'm adding some camera lenses as I think the mech would need some kind of sensors. I might also need some headlights, but I can always add those later if I need. This is just the first draft, so to speak. And of course, no mech would be complete without some hazard stripes. I'm not sure if these will go with the desert camo theme that I'm envisioning for the mech, but I've put some here just in case. I don't know if the mud on that darker texture is going to be super useful. It might actually get in the way a bit, but I leave it as it is for the time being. Looking back, that is actually the one thing that I probably should have painted over. Moving on to the blender portion of the chapter. I'm in the shading tab and I'm in the material preview mode, and before I start you can see me here adding some ambient occlusion and some screen space reflections over in the render tab on the right. I've got the rendering engine set to EV at the moment as that's the only way you can get access to these options, but we'll be switching over to cycles later on. All I use for placing the textures onto the parts is the Project from View UV mapping tool. This is so that I can choose exactly where I want the textures from the atlas to be placed on each part. There's also a certain amount of happy accidents that can occur too, especially when combined with the mirror modifier, but I'll go into that later. Right, so this is how I do the UVing. I start by grabbing all of the faces in edit mode, entering an orthographic view, side view in this case, and then pressing U and selecting Project from View. I can then go over to the UV editing window to start to choose where I want to place the object on the texture atlas. I'm also turning off Blender Overlay by pressing Shift Alt Z so I can see what the texture is doing without the orange overlay obscuring the texture. The next thing to do is to enter top view and select only the top faces, and bottom view to select only the bottom faces, and project from view again to get rid of the stretched textures from the previous projection. Like anything with 3D, this step is a bit slow going and it does take a bit of time to go around and map the textures onto all of the parts. But once it's done, you've got it forever and it will save loads of time later on. So it's worth a bit of time investment up front as it will pay off many times over in the future. Just to note, in objects that have multiple parts, I select the separate parts in the objects using L and move them around to different parts of the texture atlas to differentiate them from the texture beneath. If you add the mirror modifier to the object, provided it's symmetrical, you can then move the texture around and it will be the same on both sides. This can also create some nice unintended shapes where the texture is being mirrored along the center of the object. I go through this process piece by piece, finding the cool shapes and happy accidents and seeing what I can find. As mentioned before, it does take quite a bit of time, but if you're methodical, you can get into a real flow state whilst doing this as it's quite repetitive, so it's done before you know it. I think this whole mapping process took me an hour and a half. Again, I'm taking advantage of the mirror modifier that's already on the object to create some interesting patterns with the texture atlas. I'll be doing this on any object that's symmetrical as it's really fun experimenting and seeing what different patterns you can come up with. The reason I like experimenting with stuff like this is I can't help but think ahead to the next few stages of the process and imagine what all of these parts could be used for. As I'm going around and finding these interesting texture variations on the parts, I'm constantly thinking how could I use each part and how it could fit into the overall build. When I actually get there, I could have totally forgotten these ideas or end up not using them, but it's great motivation to get the laborious parts done so that you can get onto the fun parts, which I'm really looking forward to on this project. One thing to note here, there's a lot of geometric detail in the model that I made based on the photo reference. When I'm adding texture to these pieces, I'm making sure not to put the overly detailed parts of the texture atlas onto them, as I don't want to create too much visual noise and end up hiding the actual geometric detail. The textures are supposed to elevate the models, not make them harder to read. Now it's time to add a bit of depth and complexity to the shader. I changed the rendering engine to cycles, keeping everything default except that I changed the renderer from CPU to GPU, so that it's using my 3080 to render the viewport and not the processor, as it's much faster. I also add a sun to get some light onto the pieces. The first thing I like to do is to get some ambient occlusion onto the parts. I create an ambient occlusion node and a mix shader node, and plug the mix shader in between the principled BSDF and the material output node. I then connect the AO node to the factor of the mix shader. I also place a color ramp node between the AO node and the mix shader for extra control of the effect. I then create my shadow material, but I set this to bright red so I can see the extent of the effect whilst I'm playing with the settings. And I control the extent of the effect by adjusting the color ramp node. Because I've modeled everything fairly crudely, it's a good idea to add a bevel node to the normal slot to get a faked radius on the corners of the objects. Depending on the scale you've modeled at, you might have to change the settings to get the radius to look right. I forgot to texture up this cylinder object, so I'm just doing it now quickly. With so many parts, it can be easy to lose track of a few objects here and there, but it's not an issue to just go back and correct things as you find them. So on to the next part. It's all looking a bit too smooth, so I find an angle where a piece hits the light nicely, and then I'm going to add some roughness to the surface. I added my image texture node with the roughness map I got from my texture library, and added a color ramp in between for control. I'm playing around with that a bit here. I've already got UV set up because of the base color I did, so no need to worry about that. I want a bit more variation in the roughness map, so I'm adding a mixed RGB, another color ramp, and another image texture, this time with some scratches. It's not looking quite right, so I preview the mask with Control, Shift, left click on the node I want to preview. As you can see, the texture is coming out really pixelated and way too big. I use the Node Wrangler add-on that comes shipped with Blender, and by pressing Ctrl-T, it adds mapping nodes and texture coordinate nodes to the texture node automatically, and I simply decrease the scale until I get the result I want. I then go back to previewing the mixed mask and play with the factor until I get something that I think works. What you can see here is I'm switching back and forth between the mask preview and the final result, as when you're playing around with the mask, you can have a good idea of how it will look, but it's good to keep an eye on the actual effect on the material. And also, the material is too shiny at the moment, so I can go back to my mix node factor to tweak it. I like to add edge chipping as well. I use an add-on called Fluent Materializer to quickly achieve this. I've not delved into what the plugin is capable of yet. It's really powerful for making complex material setups, but for now, I just use it for quick AO and edge chips. You can do this with normal Blender nodes, but I don't know how, so I just use this plugin. I press F and add an All Edges node, and again, making a mixed shader and a second principled BSDF that's bright red so I can see the effect whilst I'm tweaking it. I'm plugging the All Edges node into the factor. If the chipping material is coming out as the main material, you just have to swap them around in the mix shader. I'm just playing around with the settings a little bit to tweak the effect. I'm adding a noise texture into the distance slot in the edges node so that I can vary it up a bit and get it looking a bit more rugged. It's not super accurate, but it's just a base to paint over in Photoshop. And now that I'm happy with how it's looking, I can change the chipping material to something a bit more realistic. I want it to be a bit metallic so it will catch the light in the renders, but I don't want it to be too bright as it will just end up looking like a cartoon render or an outline. The only thing I don't like about the Materializer Edge node is that it seems to apply to the cavities as well. So I move the nodes around so the ambient occlusion effect applies after the edge chipping just to try and hide that a bit. Like I mentioned before, I really should take a bit of time to sit down and learn the plugin properly because I'm sure there's a simple solution to this problem. Here, I'm just playing around with the Materializer cavity node to see if I can get a better AO effect. And I also changed the color of the ambient occlusion to get a more desert dusty feel. I think that will do for the material. It's nothing too complicated, but it's good enough for some renders and to be able to paint over in Photoshop. Another thing you can do is take a look at pre-made PBR materials for your texture projection. I got this one from textures.com, and what makes these so good is that they come with normal, roughness, specular and metallic maps, so you get a lot of extra detail without any extra effort. You can see me applying this one here in the exact same way as my texture atlas from before, and then just creating a new slot so that I can add chrome to the parts of the piston that need it. And that's everything for texturing. I'll see you in the next part for the 3D scanning chapter. Okay, so the next part in the series will focus on 3D scanning. I want to scan some real-world objects to quickly add some extra shapes into my library. You can find cool shapes everywhere if you know what to look for, and they're easily scanned with any smartphone. I use an app called Trinio 3D for my scans. The reason I like it is because you can scan in AR, which involves moving the phone around the object to plot points rather than uploading hundreds of photos. It's not as accurate, but it's fine for what I need it for. You want to scan in overcast weather conditions because you don't want to bake any kind of direct lighting into the scan. It could also work in the shade on a sunny day, but you might get some unwanted light bounce. I've exported my scans from the scanning app and brought them all into Blender in one scene. Some of the scans are a bit all over the place, so I need to do a bit of cleanup and identify the parts which I think might be useful. I create boxes and use hard ops again to cut away the parts of the scan that I don't want. You could just go into edit mode and delete the faces you don't want, but I just find this method to be quicker and simpler. The front of this digger seems like a bit of a mess at first glance, but there's loads of cool stuff in here that I can use, so I've made a copy of it because I know I want to extract and isolate multiple parts from it. Here, I'm manually deleting the leftover floor parts that the Boolean operation didn't catch. Once I've removed the floor and the bits I don't want, I make a copy and start working on the first part I want to separate, the cool metal front claw thing. It's at a funny angle, so I need to angle my cutting shapes accordingly, and then I'll straighten up the object when it's all cleaned up. You can also edit the shape of the cutting objects to get more precise cuts. Sometimes it's necessary to go into edit mode and do some manual cleanup after the Boolean operation. The next step is to apply the rotation by pressing Ctrl A and selecting rotation so that it behaves correctly when I apply modifiers to it. The reason for this will be a bit clearer later on. Then I use the same technique to extract the wheel, and I also straighten that up too.
I just want the wheel from this scan, so just like before, I use booleans to remove the floor and remove the other parts of the object that I don't want.
Next is the blue crane type thing. I start to remove the floor and that back fence, after which I decide I only really want the wheels from this one, so I get rid of the rest. I'm angling the cutting object to be in line with that back wheel here, because I may want to use that connection detail later on. I also straighten the wheel up in world space and reset rotation like before. Now comes the fun part. What we're going to do is use the mirror modifier to try and create new and interesting shapes out of these base shapes, just like we did in the part creation chapter. I've copied the forklift and now I'm extracting the shapes that I think would be cool to experiment with. That front forklift mechanism definitely has a lot of mileage in it. A seat might be useful for a mech, so I take that as well. And the sides have some cool shapes, so I'm going to extract those and see if there's something I can make from them later. The front claw thing from that digger has some really nice shapes. I'm applying the mirror modifier and playing around with the settings to see if there's any new shapes I can make. I'm also moving the origin around to change where the mirroring occurs, which makes some happy accidents. When I find something cool, I copy the object across to save it and then experiment some more. I want the part to be a bit more yellow to fit the scheme I'm planning, so I add a hue saturation node to the base color texture. The way my scanning app works, there's 4 or 5 material slots that have the texture image separated out, so I just have to copy the node into each of them for the effect to apply to the whole object. I started mirroring this wheel here to tidy up the backside a bit, then I found that I quite like this hollowed out hubless wheel look, so I've kept it as an optional part that I might use later. Now I want to start exploring shapes in the digger arm. There's a lot of mileage in this one, so I'm going to take a bit of extra time to find some cool happy accidents. Again, moving the origin around to see what I can find. I'm trying out lots of things here, flipping on different axes, using the bisect option, and also flipping the result in the modifier to see what I can get. It really is just trial and error, but I'm really happy with the results that I get, so I keep on playing to try and find some more shapes. Again, copying the object over when I find something that I like and starting to experiment again. Blender can start to lag a bit when you're mirroring on multiple axes at once and you try to move the origin, but it doesn't really show in the setup footage. You just have to be patient. The wheels need a bit of a clean up in case I want to use them where both sides are visible, so I copy them across and add a mirror modifier to remove the back sides. Again, I'm modifying the colour of these parts so that the yellow is less saturated. It's a bit irritating to have to copy the changes to every slot in the material, but it doesn't take long once you get used to it. I'm sure there's a better way of doing it, but I've not figured it out yet. I'm less convinced by the white body of the forklift, so I don't do much with it, but there's a lot of cool stuff in the other parts of the forklift, so I spend a bit of time playing around, especially that front lifting mechanism. It's fun mirroring the object in different ways to see what you can get out of it. Here, I'm thinking about what this could be in the final mech design. Maybe some kind of internal structure or some kind of railgun. It can be a good idea to keep this in mind, but it's also not necessary. Sometimes it's interesting to go into the mech design part blind. I notice here that the part I'm creating is looking a little too similar to the other ones I've made out of this object, so I change it up completely by rotating the origin and getting rid of most of the rest of the object. So now I want to add the parts to the other parts that I made. They look a bit different at the moment, so I can copy the ambient occlusion node setup from the other parts to tie them in together a bit better. I need to copy the setup to each of the 5 slots, which is a bit of a pain but doesn't take too long. It also copies over automatically to all of the other parts that share the same material. What this is doing is adding that dirty sandy look over all of the 3D scanned pieces, which makes them feel a bit more like they belong in the same environment as the other pieces. We can further tie the look together in Photoshop later on as well. Here I'm just finishing off some texturing work that I missed from the previous part. I've also just noticed I need to change that blue on the wheels, but I can do that in the next stage. When I'm creating the mech designs in the next stage, I'll also be changing the colours of the parts on the fly based on each design. So don't worry too much right now if the parts are looking a bit monotone. That's it for this part. I'll see you in the next chapter when the real fun part starts, the actual mech designing. So before starting to design the mech, I want to talk about sub-assemblies. This is an initial test mech I designed just from my raw kitbash library with the parts as they are on their own, but I wasn't happy with the way it came out. The reason I'm showing this is because I want to show in this chapter the power of sub-assemblies and the idea of exponential idea growth, and really getting the parts to work for you and getting the most mileage out of them possible. A sub-assembly is basically just a more complicated combination of the simpler parts to create new and interesting shapes that can be used in more effective ways when designing the mech. This chapter will be about getting familiar with your library and learning how to effectively utilize it to really push your design ideation. So, jumping right in, I'm starting off with some of the shapes I'm more used to and can see more of a purpose for. You can see the original mech there in the background as I started making these sub-assemblies when I was getting stuck with the design of the mech. Some of those initial generic construction shapes I made are a bit basic to be used as is, but they're great for adding detail and structure into the sub-assemblies. I noticed the lack of round shapes when I was creating the first test mech, so I'm making an effort to get more of a variety of round shapes into the sub-assemblies to break up the forms a bit. All I'm doing is trying to combine the shapes in a cool way to make more complicated assemblies that I can then use for things like limbs and structure when I'm designing the mech. I'm paying attention to the rounded versus square, And I'm also trying to make sure that the shapes aren't too busy visually, so I add areas of rest where I think they're needed.
Again, paying attention to the 70-30 rule that I've talked about in previous chapters.
There's no real direction to this at the moment, but as I get more confident with what I'm doing, I start to think a bit more about what these sub-assemblies could be used for. But I'm also careful not to get too bogged down with that, as I don't want to limit the idea generation. Everything I'm doing here is the same as what's been covered in previous chapters. Mirror modifier, changing the origins around, and booleans to cut shapes down.
You can see this stage as a bit of a warm-up to the actual design phase. As I'm combining parts here and really trying to explore my kitbash library, I'm coming up with all sorts of ideas and possibilities of things I could create in the next stage. And as usual, all of these elements I'm creating now are there in my kitbash library forever to be used on other designs and other projects.
There's a danger of making too much visual noise when combining all these parts, so I'm always zooming out to look at the overall shape to check that I'm getting the read that I want.
So here I've combined some of the generic construction shapes together, but I want it to have a bit more functionality. I'm adding pistons here to add some visual indication of what the structure might be used for. I'm keeping in mind that it needs to look kind of functional, but the way kitbashes work, it doesn't need to be 100% accurate and physically work in real life. The way I'm working at the moment is a bit sporadic. There's no real aim for now other than to just warm up and get used to how the kitbash library works best. Later on, I'm going to become a bit more focused and create mech-specific parts, but for now, all I want is to create as many cool-looking abstract assemblies as I can. It's a fluid process, which is why you'll see me dancing around from one shape to another as flashes of inspiration and new ideas occur as I work. I just want to touch on the 3D scanned elements briefly because I'm using them in a particular way in this build. I want the design to tie together ultimately, and the 3D scanned parts are a bit too dirty looking to be tied in properly with the clean modelled parts.
But they're really useful to have as indicative visual detail and noise, which really adds depth to the clean modelled parts. Here I'm building up panels around the scanned mechanical detail to create a sub-assembly.
I can already see this being like a torso shape or a pelvis shape, but I'll keep it abstract for now. So now I've got some big blocky shapes, I want to start changing things up a little bit.
The initial inspiration for this kitbash library was that military buggy with all the frame elements. So now that I'm getting into a rhythm with the sub-assembly creation, I'm making a point of introducing the tubular frame aesthetic in some of the parts.
You'll also notice here that the frame shapes are now a different colour to the rest of the library. They're the same texture sheet as the desert camo material, but I've just added a hue saturation node to change the colour to more of a dark grey. This also eliminates the need to go back into Photoshop to make any colour changes. Deviating from my references a bit, I wanted a bit of value contrast in these designs, and I wanted the tubular elements especially to stand out a bit more. I'm just adding a bit of a rounded piece here to finish the shape off, as it was looking a bit too square. Right, now onto the next piece. I want to start using the 3D scanned elements a bit more, so I'm going to focus on that for the next part that I make.
When you see me zoomed out like this and looking at all the parts, I'm assessing the whole library and picking out which parts I think would combine together to make cool shapes. I'm copying them over with Shift D rather than instancing because I don't want any changes I make to the object to affect the original object.
It's at this point that I'm starting to focus in a bit more and create mech-specific assemblies. I can't see the front of this shape as anything other than a big Gundam-like torso with those angled armor panels. This can be a good thing and a bad thing, as you don't want to limit your imagination too much, but throughout this chapter I produce enough of a balance between abstract shapes and specific mech shapes to cover both bases. I'm not quite sure what to do with this long armor panel here.
I considered cutting it short, but then I decided to lean into the panelled nature of it to see what I could come up with. I don't know how useful this part will be, but I can always modify it later with Mirror.
So moving on to the next part.
Here I'm cutting subdivisions into the shapes so that I can use proportional editing to mould it into the shape that I want.
This is a really easy thing to do. I'm using the knife tool in edit mode and I'm making sure to press A for angle constraint to get the parallel lines and C for cut through so the cuts affect the back facing polygons as well. And as you can see, it's really easy to use proportional editing to go in and mould the part to the shape you want.
Now I've got some cool blocks of shapes that I think will be useful, I want to start adding some more internal structure type shapes. Again, it just needs to kind of look like it would be able to work, but doesn't necessarily have to in reality. I'm also making sure to change the colour of these to the grey version of the texture atlas that I made in the previous chapters, because I know I'll need the value breakup so that the mechs read well. What I'm looking for here is an indication of mechanical detail and functionality, and also some negative space to contrast the big blocky shapes I've just been making. These are totally abstract at the moment. I'm not creating them to specifically be torso connections or shoulder joints or anything like that. I'm just focusing on how I can make the shape look cool and somewhat functional. I've been doing mainly symmetrical shapes so far, so I'm trying to break out of that a bit with the next few shapes. Adding more pistons and things to get them looking a bit more functional as well. Again, I want to tie the 3D scanned shapes and the clean modelled shapes together. I'm going by a rough rule of 70% clean modelled shapes and 30% detail shapes.
Now I did say I was going to focus on more internal frame shapes, but obviously I was struck by some inspiration for another blocky armor shape here. I did say I can be a bit sporadic when I'm doing stuff like this. I'll return to the frame shapes later.
I'm also making an effort to pick out shapes that I haven't used yet because it can be easy to get into the habit of using the same shapes over and over again. And I'm trying to find interesting and different ways of using them. Even looking back at the time lapse and writing this script, I'm seeing things I can potentially do with the stuff I'm making here.
So moving on,
I start to have a look at making specific torso parts here, but I'll get into that in more detail later in the chapter.
as I mentioned briefly before,
It's very Gundam, but it's a cool starting point for some more ideas later on.
it can be useful to get an idea down even if it's not a very good one, just so you can push through the resistance and get the bad ideas out of the way. I do this when I'm sketching too. I used to really struggle with getting going with a drawing, but now I've just accepted that the first 4 or 5 sketches I do will be badly drawn and not very interesting ideas, but I use those as a warm-up to get to the good stuff.
Here, I'm making some more simple shapes. I'm envisioning this being some kind of leg armor, but it could probably be used for a bunch of other different stuff. The thing I love about kitbash libraries is how versatile they are, which I'll be demonstrating later. I want to go back and really dig into making some decent frame shapes out of the tubular structures,
And not get distracted this time, because these will most likely be the starting point for the mechs that I start to make.
Again, not worrying too much about it being super functional at this point. I just want to get the right detail density down, and really getting into exploring silhouettes and proportions. So now here's where the magic happens. The real strength of this process is the potential for exponential idea generation. I know I want a load of these grey frame shapes, and I could manually make each one, but what I could do is modify the first assembly to create new shapes that fit within the same form language. There's a lot of happy accident potential in this as well, which is really fun.
All I'm doing is taking assemblies or combinations of assemblies and applying the mirror modifier to mirror the shapes in interesting ways to see what I can come up with. I'm experimenting with different axes, bisect on or off, flipping the mirror, and also moving and rotating the origin, which can often totally change the original shape. The only thing is,
Using the mirror modifier, the shapes can get a bit overly complex and a bit too repetitive, so I'm always trying to find that balance and be careful not to overdo it. As I'm doing this, I'm also getting ideas as to the kind of mechs I'm going to be creating with these assemblies. Now I'm going back and using some of the other assemblies I made, and going through the same process. And after not much time, I've got a whole new set of shapes I can use to break up the areas of armor panels in my design.
I was really pleased with how much mileage I got out of these 2 shapes. I've got a great variety of frame shapes to use, and I'm already getting excited about the sorts of things I'll be able to do with them in the next stage.
And here are all the shapes I've managed to create from just those 2 starting assemblies. Now I want to get a bit more specific about what I'm trying to create. I really like that torso shape I made before, so I'm copying that across and specifically aiming to create a few torso type shapes. I don't want to get too stuck on the idea of what the shapes need to be, as I don't want to restrict my thinking too much, but I like to have a rough idea to drive the thought process. I'm taking the initial idea and expanding on it, modifying it and trying new things with each iteration.
Just like before, I'm starting off with some fairly uninspired designs, but as I push through, I'm developing some more interesting shapes. It's really important to experiment a bit and force through that initial resistance and those first few generic ideas. Another thing that's important here, which is a bit different to the last time I mentioned, is that I'm producing designs with intention now, whereas before things were a bit looser and a bit more abstract. That can be a positive and also a negative. It's helpful to have a goal in mind in order to drive the design process, but it can also become restrictive, especially if you're struggling to think outside the box to generate some more interesting designs. I personally work really well like this once I've warmed up a bit, but it's up to you to find the balance for yourself and how you best like to work.
As you can see, like I mentioned before, the process I'm using becomes a lot easier the more assemblies you make. I'm able to generate a variety of quite different ideas relatively quickly. So now I have 6 really unique torso shapes that can drive the design of my mechs, or I can repurpose them to create totally different shapes, which I'll showcase in the next chapter.
This is why I call it exponential idea generation, because the more parts you have, the more ideas you can create, and it just snowballs after that.
I accidentally joined the objects to a shape that had the mirror modifier, which created an interesting shape that I wouldn't have found normally, so I put that aside for later. I could keep iterating for hours with this process, as it's really good fun and I tend to get carried away, but I have to be mindful of the length of this chapter.
But you can spend as much time as you like generating cool shapes.
I always struggle with legs and feet, so I'm going to use the same process as I did with the torsos to create some feet assemblies. I take the foot that I made for the original test mech and start thinking about what I could do to push it forwards a bit more. As you can see, I struggle initially, but once I get into the swing of it, they start to look really cool.
I'm actively pushing here to try and make each variation different from the last. When you look at what I started off with, it really shows the weakness I have with this sort of design work. It's a really good exercise to push your design thinking, forcing yourself out of your comfort zone. I'm also referring back to the other versions of the feet as I work, and keeping them in chronological order like this helps point out the differences in the design so you can see if the new idea is significantly different from the previous ones. I'm making sure to keep in mind detail distribution and functionality as I progress.
Again, using previously made assemblies to quickly start bulking out shapes for the feet. And also, like before, adding pistons helps sell the believability of the articulation.
Another good thing to do to quickly generate new ideas is to take elements from the previous iterations of the objects and use them in different ways. Here, I'm taking that cool foot pad shape from the second version and rotating it around and changing it so that it reads differently, and using that cool piston assembly that I made earlier in the chapter to create a new design. Same thing here, I'm taking the foot pad shapes from the other versions and combining them in a different way, and also using this really cool piston assembly that I made earlier.
I've also just noticed that all of the feet are symmetrical, which I could look into changing when I'm making the mech in the next chapter. As I'm putting the shapes together, I'm thinking about the surface area of the feet and how they'd actually support the weight of the mech. And I'm also making an effort to add some cylindrical shapes to break up the form language.
Obviously, it doesn't have to be super physically accurate, but I'm just thinking about what it would look like with this big heavy mech walking around on different surfaces and what the feet might need to look like as a result. It's things like that that drive the way I think and design objects. The rule of cool takes priority, but functionality is also important.
Using the previously made assemblies of pistons really adds a believable level of detail. One final pass over everything just to make sure I've got enough to move on to the next stage and that everything I started is finished up. Here's what I ended up making, and in the next part I'll start combining them and actually designing the mech, now that I'm in a much stronger position with my library.
I'll see you in the next part, where we'll be putting together some mechs.
In this chapter, I'm going to explore some mech designs based on the references I gathered at the beginning of the project. I'm starting off by picking out the parts I think look the most promising, looking at the frame elements as a base for the overall shape.
You can add all the parts and assemblies to a Blender asset library, but I prefer to have everything out in the scene so I can see it all together. This makes it easier to pick the right parts and make sure I'm not using the same ones all the time.
Each time I'm copying them over, I'm making sure to join all of the objects together to form a limb. This makes it easier to organise and pose the mech later on. It also means if I want to modify the sub-assembly at any point, it's easier to apply modifiers. It's a really fluid process, and as long as it's not instanced, you won't ruin the part in the library. I'm looking over at my references and inspiration images and just playing around with the shapes to see if I can find anything interesting. Always going back over to my parts library and picking out shapes that I think will be interesting to use. I'm keeping my original reference image in mind here, but I'm deviating from the idea slightly as I explore forms. I'm really liking the way things are going together so far, but this design is starting to look a bit chunky. But I'll talk about that in a bit more detail shortly. Sometimes I'll go into edit mode and make changes to the part to better fit the design.
You'll see me doing that a lot whilst I'm designing. This is because sometimes the part isn't quite right for what I need, so it just needs a bit of a tweak. Though I don't spend too much time doing it, I'm still keeping in mind that this is a quick and dirty process.
It's important to zoom out and view the design from a distance as you work, to check the stance and silhouette. You want to check things like if it looks off balance or the proportions look weird. This is all stuff that you get a feel for the more you design, so it's worth having a play around with different options. I'll reuse a part a few times, especially if it's quite versatile, but also it can be good to tie the design together if there's repeating shapes. I use this block quite a lot in this chapter as it can be used from different angles and different positions. I'm not sure where this part will go, but I know I want to use it because of the tubular elements it has.
This kind of exploration is part of this process. You can have a good idea in your head about what you want to achieve, but sometimes you just have to try a few things before getting something that works well for your design.
I settle on making a wider body out of two of them mirrored,
which I think works really well, but again, it's a bit too chunky for the light scout mech I was originally aiming for. Sometimes, when you join objects together that already have mirror modifiers added, you can get unexpected results, which are sometimes positive and something you wouldn't have made intentionally.
I accidentally made a new shape here, which I really liked, so I made sure to keep it.
So, carrying on with the design,
I'm bulking up the pelvis a little bit here with one of those torso shapes I made in the previous chapter. I also wanted to add some weight to the back of the pelvis, and then went in and fixed some texture issues so the shape read a bit better. The legs are coming across a bit monotone at the moment, so I'm changing some of the parts to the grey material so that the values are a bit more broken up.
A lot of the references I have on my board are all painted mostly in a single colour or camo pattern, I imagine for practical purposes, but I'm using a bit of artistic license to get my design reading a bit better.
I want to make some proportion adjustments here. It's super easy, one of the main advantages of 3D.
Now that the proportions are feeling a bit better, I want to go in and start adding a bit more bulk to the torso. I really like this blocky shape with the vents. I just need to find a place where it will fit. It takes a bit of time, but I think it works. Here, I'm trying to introduce the bar elements back in to try and remain faithful to the original inspiration. This also helps break up a lot of those large flat surfaces. Remember from the previous chapter, I'm always thinking about the 70-30 rule as a way of making things look cool. So, moving on a bit, I had originally intended to do a lightweight agile scout mech, but it's at this point I realised that the mech I'm designing currently is a bit chunkier and looks more like a medium grunt mech than a scout mech. When we iterate later, it's easier to pivot the design and leave this one as a first attempt, which is perfectly reasonable, but here I decided to produce 3 mechs of the same family, big, medium and small. I always think a family of mechs from the same team in the same design language looks super cool. It's an interesting design challenge and it gives me more of an excuse to build more mechs. So as you can see, I've got some arms here now. I'm adding some pistons here and there to make the limbs seem more believable, and it also helps break up the values a bit. Also, I'm bulking up the rear of the mech a bit. With the front of the mech protruding so much, it needs a bit of balance, and also it ties some of the shapes together back there as well. I'm adding those round shapes to the shoulders to cover up where the arm joins, but also to tie into the round shapes on the pelvis. I'm not paying too much attention to how the joints work at the moment, but if the design were to develop, I could go in and work it out with sketches. This is more of a blue sky thinking phase, where we'll get some cool look and feel artwork to sell the design. But if it needs to be figured out mechanically later, to describe to animators for example, there's enough information there to go back in and develop how it would actually work. Sometimes, when playing around with modifiers, it can make a bit of a mess of things, like with this piece. So I just needed to go in and fix the stretched out textures. Going back to the design, I want to add some more visual detail and flat surfaces to the chest area, so this piece is perfect. I'm also tying the design together by repeating this tubular element to the arms, and it also adds some value breakup to the arm area as well. I want some hands for these particular mechs, so I take some of the base objects from the library and bash some simple hands together. Doesn't need to be anything too complicated, as it's only going to be seen from a distance. It doesn't make any sense for robot fingers to have different lengths like human fingers, but it looks weird if they're all the same size, so I adjust them all slightly. And then I'll just give it a simple pose to look more natural. Those hands can also go back into the parts library for use on other mechs in the future. And also, I'm making multiple versions in different poses, just so that I don't have to pose them every single time I get them out of the kitbash library. And now, when I applied them to the mech, I realised they need some kind of attachment point, so that's what I'm making here. It's at this point that I start to think the mech is looking a little bit too static. So I'm going back and joining the parts together into rough limbs so I can parent them together and pose the legs slightly. Also, whilst I'm doing this, I'm figuring out where the joint should pivot. I'm doing this by setting the 3D cursor roughly where I want the pivot to be and setting the origin to 3D cursor in the right click menu. I'm parenting the objects together from the bottom up so that they all move together as one, but I'll cover this in more detail later in the chapter. I then copy the limbs over and check the mech proportions are looking right or if there's anything I can improve on. I want to widen the silhouette a little bit. I'm kind of looking at the samurai armor reference from my reference board when I'm adding these armor panels to the shoulders. It's not as explicit as I'd originally intended, but maybe I'll develop this later. I find the legs of mechs can look quite static when I build them in the orthographic axes, so I like to angle them slightly for a more natural pose. This is why I did all that grouping and parenting earlier. I like to check how the design reads with shadow, so I'm quickly looking at it in cycles with the lighting setup that I did earlier in this chapter. Now I'm taking the knowledge from my first design and using it to move on to the Scout mech, so a lighter, more agile version of the medium mech I just designed. I'm looking for thinner, longer limbs and a smaller torso. Again, I'm always zooming in and out and checking the stance and proportions of what I'm putting together, always trying to use the objects from the library in new and interesting ways. My thought process here is that I want to get the same feel as the medium mech, but getting it to look like it's been on a diet. I associate recon scout type vehicles with being fast, agile, difficult to catch so that they can get in and out of enemy territory and hopefully without being caught. I'm breaking up the legs a bit more this time with some of the grey frame shapes, trying to add to the lightweight unarmoured feel. Again, I'm not too fussed about how all of this would intersect and pivot, but we're just going for cool factor at the moment. This is quite a cool shape I've not used yet, so I'm going to see what I can do with it. Looking back at this now, I think it would have been cool to modify this shape a bit and see what came out of using a mirror modifier maybe, but I think it ended up looking okay anyway. I decided to change the top of the leg to something more skeletal. It was looking a bit too bulky and armoured, but that part with the negative space in the piston works really well for this design. It's okay to go back and change stuff as the design progresses. That's the beauty of such a fluid process. I'm reusing the pelvis shape from the medium mech, but changing the way that I use it a bit, so it's mirroring the same design language but not a direct copy. If you're only designing one mech, you don't have to worry about this too much, but as I'm designing 3, I just like to make sure they all sit together properly. I'm just tweaking the proportions of the legs a bit before going back and finishing off the pelvis. I'm determined to use this 3D scan part for something, so I take it and repurpose it to add a bit more structure and mechanical detail.
It's not perfect, but like with the other 3D scan parts, it provides a good enough base for some areas of visual detail and to build other parts around. I want to add some more tubular elements to add to the lightweight feel, and also tie back to that original reference that inspired the library. A little bit of modification, and I've got a part that fits really nicely. Now I'm at the stage where I want to pose the legs to stop it looking so static like I did on the medium mech. Again, joining the parts up and setting the pivots so I can parent them together. But I am going to make a few adjustments here just to make sure the foot is symmetrical. So I said I'd go into a bit more detail about parenting, so we'll do that on this leg. I select the first object and then the second object and press Ctrl P and click Object. You do this from the bottom of the limb upwards so that the top element controls the bottom elements in the hierarchy. I make sure to do this after the pivots have been set and also before I copied the leg over so that I don't have to do it twice. Here I'm just fixing an issue with the texture mapping. Like I mentioned earlier, sometimes that can happen if you mess around with the object a lot with modifiers. Now I just want to add a couple of little extra details before copying the leg over like before. When I'm posing the legs, I use angle snap so that I can put them back into orthographic planes if I need to. It just means that if I know I've moved the leg 10 degrees, it's easier to find the straight point than if I just moved it 9.23 degrees, for example. So now I'm going back up and doing a little bit more work on the torso. I really like these air intakes, and I figured they would fit the style of a light, fast scout mech, so I make them fit the frame that I already have from the main body. I choose to detach them from the main object so I can modify them to make them fit without changing the other object. I also go back in and modify the frame slightly to make the air intakes fit better. I need to fill in a bit of a gap in the waist here, so I just use a 3D scan part to add some visual detail and noise. Plus, I've not used this part much yet. Now I'm going back in with the shoulder shapes from the medium mech to tie the language together. It's not exactly the same, but it's enough to visually link. Here's a piece that I've not used loads yet, so I change it around a bit to make it into an arm. I don't know exactly where it'll go yet, but it's definitely useful, especially when I slim it down a bit. I still really like that piece with the piston and the negative space that I've used on the thigh, so I reuse it here at the top of the arm as a starting point, but then add some extra parts to change the look a bit. I'm separating out this piston just to make the joint make a bit more sense. As you can probably tell, I'm not paying loads of attention to physical accuracy in these builds, like the way things would actually move and pivot in real life, but if something is really standing out to me as not making sense, I'll go in and modify it until I'm happy. And now I'm happy with the arm, I'm going to copy it over and pose it just like I did with the legs to get a bit more of a natural stance. So I've got the small mech to a point where I'm quite happy with it, so I'm going to put it next to the medium mech to see how it looks. And after a few small adjustments, I'm really happy with that, so now I'm going to move on to the heavy mech. I've been eyeing up this frame piece for a while, so I decided to start off with it as a base. I'm going super wide and chunky with this one, and I really want to differentiate it from the other two. It's really fun layering shapes up and seeing what fits together. Just like before, I'm going through the process of swapping between frame pieces and blocky pieces and just trying to find a nice balance and figure out how I want my mech to look. That shape I accidentally created in the last chapter is really paying off. I think I'll have used it in all 3 builds by the end. I can already see how I want the rest of the mech to look based on how this torso is turning out. I'm really enjoying this super wide, super chunky feel that it's developing. Now I've got the rough shape for the torso, I want to move on to the legs. I really like these half 3D scan and half modelled pieces, so I'm going to find a way to use those in here a bit more. They're good for breaking up the flat surfaces. Spending a bit of time in the last chapter making those foot sub-assemblies is really paying off. It's given me a lot more to work with when actually iterating with the mech designs. I want the feet to be a lot chunkier here to support all that extra weight and extra armour panels to bulk up the leg. So using the existing foot as a base, I can go in and edit it and make it a bit chunkier. I'm adding in some extra pistons to increase the visual detail down there and to give the impression that the foot needs a lot of extra support because of the weight of the mech. This bit of mechanical detail on the side of the leg is cool, but I think it's a bit too exposed, so I'm using that armour panel piece from the other builds to indicate some kind of extra armour situation. So I'm just making the last few tweaks to the leg. And then I'm going to have a look at the pelvis because I need to start thinking about how the legs are going to connect to the body and how that's going to look silhouette wise. I'm going to start off with those inner frame shapes, which are proving really, really useful in these builds. That little bit of extra work making them in the last chapter is really paying off. I'm posing and mirroring the leg really quickly here as I have a fairly good idea of what will look good, and I can go back in and parent everything up later if necessary. I could just paint over it like this rather than doing a fancy pose. This is because at the time I didn't want to interrupt my idea generation flow state. Now the pelvis isn't finished, but I've just noticed a bit on the back here that I want to fill in using one of these bigger parts. If you find the perfect piece but it's too big, don't be afraid to chop the shape up to suit your needs. Like I did here using the Boolean tool. I'm using that pelvis/torso piece again, but in a different way. I just wanted to add some rounder elements to the body of this mech as it was looking a bit too angular. Also, going back in with that accidental piece here as I think it makes a really good pelvis armour. I'm making the arms for this one in the same way as the previous two, but using chunkier parts to add to that heavy look. I'm not so sold on the long humanoid arms for this one, but I can develop the idea later. Now I'm using the parts on the shoulders to tie it in with the other variants. Now I'm just going back in with some piston details that I took from the other mechs and some pistons straight out of the kitbash library and adding a bit of believability to these arm joints. Then I pose and mirror the arm across. Again, just like the legs for this one, I didn't bother parenting them, but I knew what I wanted, so I just went ahead and did it. Here you can see all the mechs together. They're clearly different in size and stature, but they all belong to the same family because of the way I've approached the design process. Now these mechs have arms, so they're going to need weapons to hold. I've got 3 reference photos, an assault rifle, an SMG and a minigun, and I just use my shapes to approximate the 3 guns the best I can with what I've got. All I'm looking for here are proportions and overall shape, as the weapons aren't a very important part of the design at this stage. I just need something for the mechs to hold. As you can see with the assault rifle, the weapons come together really quickly and they're really effective. If there's anything that doesn't look right when I render, I can just paint over and simplify in Photoshop. And just like I did before with the internal frame parts, I've made a copy of the material and added a hue saturation node to the base color to change the weapon color to black. That's the assault rifle done. Now onto the minigun. Super simple stuff, just following my reference photos. I've gotten a lot of mileage out of this cylindrical shape. I should have made more round shapes for the library really, and I might add some later, but it's been a good challenge to think of new inventive ways to use this piece. Here I'm using it to make all the barrel shapes for the weapons. Again, cutting up my older shapes to make them fit what I want. Although I didn't make many round shapes for the library, the pieces I did make have been really versatile. I've used these 2 particular shapes absolutely everywhere. Onto the SMG now, which was a bit trickier but ended up looking okay. I used the assault rifle as a base as I didn't see the point of starting from scratch. I'm making sure to go back to my reference photos to check proportions and get the right read for this type of weapon. Proportional editing is so useful for this kind of thing. I'm adding some details that kind of look like weapon sights, which makes no sense for a robotic mech as it would probably have targeting systems or whatever, but I thought the silhouette needed some smaller details. And here are all 3 finished weapons together. There's a lot of back and forth, but each mech took about 20 to 30 minutes to make, which is no time at all really considering the detail. Now onto the really fun part, iterating. I'm not so sure about the mechs with the humanoid arms, and I think I can push the legs a little bit further, so I can take what I've already done and quickly iterate on it to generate new designs and configurations. Here, I'm pulling apart the legs of the Scout to make something a bit different. This is where the angle snap becomes useful because I can easily put the legs back into the orthographic axis for editing. My thought process here is how can I make a slim, light, agile looking leg but not go for the normal single knee bend that I normally go for. The new legs might not work, but it's so quick to try that it's always worth seeing what you can find. I could definitely push the ideas further, but I'm conscious of the length of the chapters. Now I'm taking elements from the medium mech and using them here to see what it looks like. Again, to try and differentiate these ones from the previous versions. I want the weapon to be a hard point attachment rather than held in a hand, so I take the weapons I did previously, change them a bit and add some shapes to make it more like an attachment. I like this panel from the medium mech, so I take that and use it as well. Maybe he's got one arm that holds a shield, that could be cool. I like the asymmetry, so I'm leaning into that a bit. The body could also be a bit more asymmetrical, but I can play with that later if I want. Now I want to see if I can get a second version of the medium, changing the leg stance and using some different elements to get some variety going. It takes me a bit of time to figure them out, but I'm really trying to push the legs towards something different than what I normally do. I think it would be really beneficial to take my library and actually produce 10 different sets of legs and make it a challenge to get them all looking as different as possible. I get so stuck in muscle memory sometimes when I'm trying to produce something new, it becomes really frustrating when the same things keep coming out. And the only way to overcome that really is to force yourself to produce new things like I'm doing here. And as an added benefit, I'd then have 10 sets of legs I could use on other designs later on. Not so sure about these legs, but it's good to try different stuff. They kind of work, but I prefer the previous ones. And I decided to go full on with the quadruple miniguns on this version. So I'm pretty happy with where the second version of the medium is at the moment, so I'm going to put that aside and move on to the heavy mech. I wanted to do something different with the heavy, and there's that large frame element as well that has sparked off an idea. I don't want to reuse the legs from the first heavy, so I'm going to see if I can do something a bit more interesting. I take the legs from the medium and play around with them a little bit to get a quadruped mech. It takes a while to get the stance right, but I'm really happy with the differentiation from the first one, and it still fits nicely with the design language of the others. It's coming out a bit shorter than the other heavy mech, so I'm just going to scale it up a little bit. I don't want to use the miniguns again, so I create a huge double shotgun type thing with the SMG on top of the minigun base.
It really is just a case of using the shapes that you've got and figuring out cool new things to make with them.
That's the beauty of this process. Once you've got the parts and the sub-assemblies, you can produce so many different ideas so quickly. I could keep going with the exploration, but again, the chapter would be too long. So I'm going to pick the 3 mechs I like the most and get them rendered out. So let's look at that in the next chapter. This will be a relatively short chapter, but I'm just going to run you through how I'd render something like this, ready for paint over in Photoshop. I'm also going to go over a simple lighting setup as well. But before rendering, I decided to have a play around with my designs a little bit.
I liked elements from the first set, and I liked elements from the second set, so I decided to consolidate the things that I liked into 3 final designs. I actually changed these up a little bit more before I render them, but I'll point that out when we come to it. So as you can see here, I'm starting with the medium mech. I copy over the base medium, which is the one I like the most, but I wanted to lean into that asymmetrical feeling that I mentioned before. It doesn't take much, but I think the torso looks a lot more interesting with that offset dome type shape. I also take the single arm idea from the second iteration of the light mech that I did in the previous chapter. I've got all of the elements I need available to me for these new iterations, so all I'm doing is just picking the shapes from the old mechs that I think are cool, a bit like we did before with the initial creation of the mechs with the kitbash library, and placing the parts to try things out and see what works. I'm really liking this shoulder pad with the plates and the bars. It really ties in with the feel that I want for these designs. As I'm adding new elements, I'm making sure that things make a bit of sense, like adding connecting joints so the silhouette makes sense and nothing's floating in midair too much. That's why I've added this connecting joint to the shoulder pad here. To finish off, I'm resizing the mech so that it's the correct scale compared to the person there. Now moving on to the light mech. I preferred the original design as a base, so I copy that over as a starting point, but then adding some elements from the second one that I think work better, like this torso shape here. I'm making tweaks to the torso here to try and make the design language fit with the medium a bit more. I like those front air intakes, so I keep the symmetrical nature of this one, but I'm adding some more rounded shapes and shifting things around a bit to get something a bit more in line with the medium. I try a few versions. Sometimes the right solution doesn't present itself first time round, but it's quite cool to be able to move parts about, resize things, and see what works best. It's really not a problem for me to go in and edit my shapes to make them suit my needs a bit more. Having these base shapes and textures is always a great starting point for any new or altered shapes that I need to make. I could then put them back into the asset library later on if I need to. I like the version of the small mech that has the light cannon type thing, so I copy that across to the new version. It could be a cool idea to have one fixed gun on one side, but a humanoid arm on the other side so that when it runs out of ammo, it can drop or stash that rifle and pick up a close combat weapon maybe. I'm thinking about it as I'm moving parts around, but I'm not totally sure yet. I tried to keep the asymmetry by trying different types of guns on the other side, but eventually I end up just going full symmetrical as I landed on the idea that 4 light cannons would look the most cool for something this small and agile. I do try to put a bit of the symmetry back in by adding this radar type device on one of the shoulders, but again, not being able to find the right place for it, I end up putting it between the shoulders on the back of the mech. You can see me here trying to figure out where to place it. Sometimes it's a bit frustrating when something just won't click like this, but sometimes settling on a less than perfect solution is necessary. So I actually end up taking the symmetrical weapon route with all 3 mechs in the end, but the final designs will be shown at the end of the chapter. I'm showing this part of the process more to demonstrate how easy it is to tweak the designs and come up with new ideas even at this late stage. Again, making sure the scale of the mech is relative to the scale figure and the medium mech. I can't stress enough how important scale is. Now onto the heavy. There's a bit more chopping and changing with this one, so rather than take the whole mech as a base, I just take the legs from the first one. I'm bulking up the silhouette a bit here using parts I've already used on the medium mech. I felt like the connections between the legs and the pelvis were a bit flimsy. Also, there's some areas of noise that I think break up the design a bit too much, so I cover them with some reused parts. It's a bit of a pain to angle the new parts correctly, but it doesn't have to be super accurate. The alternative is having to straighten the limbs up and then repose them again after editing them. I like the shape of the body from the second one, so here I combine it with the legs that I just modified. I need to do a bit of fiddling around to get them to fit together correctly, but I'm much happier with the overall shape than before. I really like these huge frame elements that I'm imagining need to be really strong to hold the weight of the guns or arms. I'm really leaning into that super wide feeling here. With the new combination of parts, I felt like the torso was feeling a bit too fragile considering it's supposed to be the super heavy mech. So I go through a process of moving some other parts over, trying them out and seeing where they fit. Just like before, it's taking a bit of trial and error, but that's the fun of the process. I want to get the same sort of feeling as the small and medium mechs, so that they all look good together, but I'm having a bit of trouble here filling all of that space because the heavy mech is just so much bigger than the other two. The issue I'm having is it's getting a bit noisy and hard to differentiate the torso shapes. I end up playing around with this a bit more after I stop recording, but you can see that at the end of the chapter when I show the final renders. It ends up looking a bit busy even after all the tweaking, but I can knock that back in Photoshop. I always think it's easier to take detail away and simplify in Photoshop rather than having to add complexity and detail with photo bashing and other 2D techniques. Photo bashing is cool and I use it a lot, but with the process in this tutorial it's not necessary to get a good level of detail and visual noise. So after playing around a bit with the torso, I take the huge shotgun type weapon from the quadruped heavy and the humanoid arm from the bipedal heavy and position them on the new design. There's not a lot of tweaking necessary here, as I was quite pleased with how both of these turned out, and the size seems to fit pretty well too. Maybe the shotgun weapon needs to be a bit longer. I'm also trying to tie the mechs together further by using that cool shoulder paddle shape that I mentioned before. I don't want to use it in exactly the same way as on the other mech, but I think it could look cool if I find a good way to use it. And finally, making the heavy mech fit the scale with the other mechs. Actually, maybe it needs something to hold in its hand. I like this huge minigun thing from the first design, though I think it'd be cool if it was shooting it with one hand. I'd probably go into a little bit too much detail with this, but I wanted to make sure I could fire it single-handed, so I started moving things around to add a trigger to the main handle instead of the now unused grip at the back. I probably could have done this in Photoshop as it's such a small detail, but if I wanted to do a turnaround animation, it would annoy me if the weapon didn't make at least a little bit of sense. So I go in and change it in 3D. I also changed the hand so that it's holding the weapon correctly. In reality, a mech probably wouldn't have a hand. The weapon would probably be fixed on a hard point at the end of the arm, but I think mech hands are cool, so I'm using hands. I end up not using this design, but I've still got all the parts ready to go if I want to design any more mechs in the future. The really valuable parts here are things like the hands. I'm always in need of robotic hands for any kind of mech like this, so it's really useful to have some ready to go, so I don't have to make new ones every time. I'm also really pleased with how the arms looked. Even though I don't use them in the end, I'll definitely save those for another project in the future. I'm still playing around with this heavy torso. I can see something's not quite right with it, but I haven't figured out the solution yet. I just couldn't leave it alone even when I'd stopped recording. I really wanted to get the asymmetry working so that it matched the medium mech a bit more. And here's where I make the change to the weapon's trigger like I mentioned before. Again, it's only a small detail, but it would have really bugged me if I'd have left it in. I'm also not being too precise here, I'm just giving a general shape to the new handle. I'm just doing a bit of organisation here. I want each mech to be in the centre point of the world so I can use the same lighting setup for each. So I put them into groups and move each one into the middle. I also changed the aspect ratio to more suit the proportions of the mechs. I'm also having a think about the best camera angle to show the mechs. There's also the question of does each mech have a different camera angle? It's ultimately personal choice, but in this case I wanted to line all of the mechs up together to show the size relative to each other, so I keep the camera position almost identical for each of the mechs. I'm putting a ground plane down here so that I can get some cast shadows on the floor. It's good to ground objects in this way. This is a fairly standard lighting setup. What I'm aiming for is a top-down light to get the main shapes of the mech, and then rim lights on either side to show off the shapes properly. I've set the environment to relatively dark with no HDRI, as the lights I'm setting up can do all of the legwork for me. HDRIs can be really good sometimes for an instant natural looking lighting setup, but it wasn't really necessary for this project. As you can see here, I'm playing around with the sizes and intensities of my lights to get the right balance. There's not a one-size-fits-all set of settings, so I'm not going to go over those in too much detail, but what I'm aiming for is a strong rim light on either side of the mech, and a soft fill light above shining down at an angle to make sure I also get some bounce light coming up from the floor plane to illuminate the undersides of the shapes. As I'm looking at the viewport render, I notice that the connection to the weapon arm seems a bit skinny, so I go back in with some extra geometry to bulk it up a bit. I also try a bit of an uplight, as that can sometimes add some dramatic effect to the render and show the shapes a bit better. I make an area light and position it so it's shining up from the base of the mech. Here you can see I'm trying out different colours to see if anything jumps out at me. That's the beauty of Cycles. It's so fast you can try these different setups out on the fly without having to constantly wait for renders to update. I'm tweaking the camera view to see if there's a way I can better show off the design. I always find it tricky with the three-quarter views, how best to show the idea. Sometimes you need multiple angles to show off the shapes properly. Now onto the medium. The lighting setup is already there from the heavy, so no need to make any changes to the lights, though I do need a different camera for this one as it's smaller than the big mech and I want the render to fill up the frame ideally. I'm showing the setup for all three mechs, but I'm only going to paint over the medium mech in the next chapter. The legs were looking a bit out of proportion to me, so I'm just scaling them up a bit last minute and making sure the mech is on the ground plane before moving on to the small mech. Again, the lighting setup can remain the same for the small mech, and I'm also just making sure the camera is positioned correctly. And I'm also going to set the background to transparent in film settings in the render tab, so that when I render them, I can save them as PNG with an alpha, but more on that later. I try a couple of different colours for the rim lights, but decide to keep it white in the end. Here, I'm playing around with the different intensities for the lights to see if I can balance the render a bit better. I do a lot of work in Photoshop, so this isn't something I spend too much time on in 3D. Here, I'm playing around with the overhead fill light to see if the mech would benefit from a bit more or a bit less contrast. I'll always play around with stuff like this before pressing the final render. Again, I can push this quite a lot in Photoshop, but I want to make sure that everything that can be done in 3D is done so that I don't have to go back into Blender and change stuff once the final renders are done. I want to move over to Photoshop and just work in Photoshop without having to keep switching back and forth. You'll also notice that there's no ground plane in this video, but I'll be adding that back in the Photoshop phase. I'll showcase in the next chapter, but I do 2 sets of renders so that I can cut the mech off the ground plane and soften the transition between the ground and background. At the moment, it's just set to hidden, but it'll still affect the light and shadows in the scene. I know I said that the lighting setup didn't need to be changed between the mechs, but looking at this a second time, I wasn't quite happy with how the lights were hitting the heavy mech, as it was a lot bigger than the other two. I could have reduced the size of the mech, but I'm a bit of a scale purist. I like things to be the correct real-world scale in Blender, so I created a new lighting setup especially for the heavy and put it in a separate group. And here are the final renders. Join me in the next chapter where we'll do the final paint over of the medium mech. So now I've got the raw renders, I can take them into Photoshop to start the paint over process. I've got one base render, a render with no floor that I use as a mask, and then a red render that I'm going to use with the mask to add some paint variation to the mech. I use a mask to paint out that hard edge on the floor and add a background colour that blends together with the floor. I then add a mask to the red layer and invert it and use the hard brush to paint in where I want the red on the mech to be. This is a fairly crude method, but for me it's much quicker than setting up masks etc. in Photoshop, and if any of the reflections are wrong you can just paint them later. Also, for some reason, the mask render that I did was an older version of the shoulder panels which aren't as wide. You can see me figuring that out here. It's an easy fix though, I just select from the layer below and update the mask. I'm deviating from the initial reference a bit with this paint scheme, but I wanted to try and push the colours a bit further, so I'm adding the red as some kind of squad marking. I think the mechs will look really good together with the paint scheme tying them together. The red is looking a bit faded, so I go into colour balance and hue saturation to bump it up a bit. There are certain areas that are now too oversaturated, but I'll paint those out later. The first thing I like to do when I start to paint over a 3D render is to mess it up a bit. I have this really rough John Park brush that I always use to go in and paint out any details that I don't want and adding panel lines and things like that. It's a really rough brush and it doesn't look so good now, but I'm always trying to get away from that 3D feel to get it to look more like a painting. And I find this brush is perfect for not being too precious about the paint strokes. As mentioned in previous chapters, I much prefer to paint details out and simplify things than to have to add details with photos and textures in Photoshop. There's a lot of fine detail here from the textures that create a cool base, but now I've got design that I want to read well, I'm going back in and painting some of it back so the surfaces are less noisy. At this stage it's very rough and I'm not worrying too much about precision. I'm going to use a bit of artistic license now. When I rendered with the floor, it killed some of the rim lights and made some of the down-facing surfaces quite dark, so I'm using the mask render that I did, which has no floor, to bring some of those back up to bump it all up a bit. I'm going around with a soft brush on that mask layer and choosing where to add some extra rim lights and bump up some of those dark areas as well. Now with all that fixed, I can carry on with the paint over. This is a really satisfying thing to do and probably one of my favourite parts of the process. I love going round and figuring out what to paint out and what to paint in and how to tie the 3D model together into a coherent design. It's really therapeutic and I really get into the zone when I do this. I'm also thinking about how the parts intersect with each other, and I'm trying to make each part of the mech feel like a cohesive and manufactured object rather than an assortment of random parts. It doesn't need much, but having that outcome in mind really helps me figure out where I need to paint and add elements. There are certain areas where I imagine joints to be, so I take a bit of time cleaning those areas up of any unnecessary noise and implying that the limb has the ability to rotate, like I did with that ankle piece there. If this design were to move on to the next stage, then I would take a bit of time and figure out the actual pivots of the joints and how they could operate with a decent range of movement without any intersection. So now I'm going to let the time-lapse play on as I want to show the whole paint process, but there's not a lot to flag up whilst I'm doing this rough pass. I'll jump back in when I need to explain what I'm doing when I move on to the refinement stage.
Just a quick note here, sometimes I like to go back in after the fact and make changes to the design, but I really don't like going back and forth from 3D to Photoshop. I think the pelvis crotch area is looking a bit too straight and flat, so I want to get a bit more shape into it. What I do here is get a square 100% hard smudge brush and just shift the shape around a bit on a new layer, making sure to press sample all layers in the tool settings. I can then erase the bits I don't want and paint it back into it to tie it in properly. So now I've made a new layer, I may as well start the refinement. What I mean by that is I choose my refining brush, which I believe is a John Woolley Liberto brush, and go back in and tighten up the areas that were roughly painted in before. Not too much, but enough to sharpen things up a bit. I also like to go in and add some tone variation to the flat 3D surfaces, which will see me do a lot. All I do is colour select the area I want to paint on, darken it down in the colour palette, and paint into the area, leaving the edges and some patches. This does a really good job of getting rid of that overly perfect 3D look. I also do a lot of edge highlighting to pop certain edges and surfaces out. Again, I'll let the time lapse play and I'll jump back in when I get to the decals and the other finishing touches. So with the main portion of the paint overdone, I want to add some decals to the mech to add a bit of scale and believability. I take these scale model decals that I found on Google and get rid of the white using the layer style menu. If you press Alt, you can separate that little arrow and feather the effect. I need to apply this so I can edit the layer, so I isolate the layer by pressing Alt and clicking on the eye symbol, select the whole canvas using Ctrl A and then press Copy Merged, which is Shift Ctrl C, and then paste that back onto a new layer. I now have the transparent decals on a layer without the layer adjustment, so I can go in and use the levels adjustment to make them all white. There might be an easier way to do this, but this is the method that I just got used to using. I can then pick out the decals I want to put onto my mech. I select the ones I want and copy them onto new layers by pressing Ctrl J so I can move them around independently. I always have the auto select layer enabled on the move tool, which is how I find my way around my Photoshop documents. Basically, if I want to go to a layer, I'll hold Ctrl and drag move the layer I want to go to and then quickly press Ctrl Z to undo the move, but stay on the layer I want to be on. This is why you'll see layers moving around and then going back to their original position. Sometimes I'll miss the layer I want and I'll accidentally move the layer below, which is really annoying, but I've gotten used to working this way. I don't know how people navigate PSDs without doing this. I can then take the decals I've selected and roughly place them where I want them to be on the mech. This is so I can get a good idea of the distribution and what might look good where. After that's done, I can warp them all into perspective to make them sit on the surfaces properly. I know there's a way of doing this in Blender, but I haven't got around to figuring it out yet. This is a bit fiddly, but it doesn't take too long once you get into the swing of it. I'm so used to doing it now that it's just part of the process. After they're all looking correct, I lock the transparency and paint in the shadows to get them to feel like they're part of the mech. I go around and softly brush in a darker colour where the decals fall into the shadow areas. I always find that decals and markings really add to the mechanical design. I think it's because we expect to see things like that on machines based on what we see in the real world. I'm now at a point where I've got the main bulk of the work done and can now relax a bit. The finishing touches are like a nice treat at the end of a painting where you can spend a bit of time pushing and pulling things to get the best result. It's fun to try different things out. In this instance, I'm just doing a 3/4 view, so I'm not going to do anything too fancy. I start off by pushing the lighting a bit by adding a color dodge layer and lightly brushing a mid value from the top. This makes everything pop a bit more. I'm being careful not to overdo it, and I'm focusing mainly on the upward facing surfaces so that I don't lose the contrast in the shadows. I can see that the guns, especially its right hand one, are getting a bit lost in the values, so I'm going in and adding some fog to separate out the elements a bit. It doesn't need much, but it can be really helpful to get the design to read better. I select the area using the lasso tool and add a mask to the layer so I can use it again in the future if necessary. I set the blending mode to lighten and softly brush a mid-tone to equalize the values a bit and knock some of the contrasty detail back. I repeat the process on the other side just to get that gun barrel to read a bit better against all that visual noise behind it. The last thing I do to this design is add some weathering and some rust streaks to add a bit of aging and believability. As anyone who knows my work will tell you, I love a bit of weathering and rust. I think it adds a nice lived-in feel, like this vehicle has some history and has been around a bit. You could also add things like scratches and battle damage, but I just leave it at rust streaks for this image. All I do is add a multiply layer and use a relatively saturated orange mid-tone and brush in streaks and dirt into the crevices. Again, like with the decals, it's a bit of a repetitive process, but I really get into the zone with stuff like this. I really enjoy going around and thinking about which parts would have rust building up and where the aging would be. I'm going to let this play again until the end, where I'll point out a couple more refinements before we finish. The last thing I do to every image that I make is copy merge the whole image to a new layer and then add an unsharp mask filter to sharpen everything up. I add one final curves adjustment to do a final tweak of the values and I'll call it done. So with that, I'll see you in the next chapter where I'll do a summary of the workshop and some final thoughts. So here are the final images all painted up. I just wanted to recap on the key ideas and themes that we went over in this workshop. First of all, you can ask yourself a few simple questions to come up with a loose brief. This isn't totally necessary, but I find it really useful to have some parameters defined so that I can focus on my thinking and reference gathering. You can then use that brief to start reference gathering using Pinterest. Looking at reference to build up an idea based on your brief, to define the overall feel of the kitbash library you want to create, but also looking out for specific parts that you think would be good to model up to add to the library. Using that reference board you created, you can then set about modeling up the parts you think are cool and would like to add to the library. This is the part that takes the longest, but a bit of time investment early on leads to a lot of time saved in the later parts of the design process. You then need to texture your pieces before doing anything else so that you don't need to individually texture the parts after creating the sub-assemblies and the mech designs. You can do this a number of different ways, but I prefer to use one or two texture atlases to save memory in Blender and make modifying the materials easier. You can also use 3D scanning to quickly and easily add complexity into your kitbash library. Then, taking your simple textured shapes, you can create more complicated sub-assemblies. This is where you can also modify the shapes and sub-assemblies to create new variations and stretch out the usefulness of each part. This is the point where it's also good to keep in mind the detail breakup and areas of rest using the 70-30 rule. I mentioned it a few times, but the key idea for this whole workshop is exponential idea growth. The more parts you make and modify, the more new parts and therefore the more ideas you can generate. With the sub-assemblies, you'll be in a much better position to start designing your mech and creating variations quickly and easily as you develop the designs. In this workshop, I was able to quickly generate 3 different designs for my team of mechs and then ideate 3 additional ideas and combine them at the end, taking parts I liked from each iteration to create the final designs. This is a really fun part of the process, but it's easy to get carried away generating loads of ideas without actually coming to any conclusions. Then, with a simple lighting setup and 2 or 3 renders, you can go into Photoshop to finish the design, bringing it to life with decals and weathering. The start of this process is a bit time consuming, especially the modelling, but the key thing to remember is you now have all of these pieces and sub-assemblies for use on other projects, and you can create multiple libraries to cover different project requirements. You don't necessarily have to design just mechs either. The focus of this workshop has been mechs because they're my favourite thing to do, but you could design any kind of hard surface object. Here's an APC I made using the same kitbash library from the same world as the mechs. It's not totally polished, but I'll go back in and finish this at a later date. But the point is, it was really quick to get to this point, using my kitbash library and some other high quality assets to quickly build up my scene and give the design some context. Also, if you remember the sleek racing mech brief from the beginning of the workshop, here's a quick design I made using the same kitbash library. All I did was modify the parts a bit to make them a bit more curvy and change the material. It's nothing fancy and it would need a lot of paint over to make the joints make sense, but as a starting point that I bashed together in 30 minutes, it's not bad. It just goes to show how versatile the kitbash library I just created can be with some adjustments. So, with that, I hope you enjoyed the workshop and that I was able to show you something new. I'd love to see what you come up with, so feel free to reach out to me on ArtStation or Instagram. And also, if you have any questions, you can contact me there too. Thanks!